One of my specialties in my studies is grief. So with grief, I will touch up a lot on the subject. So with grief, there is such thing as normal grief and complicated grief. The difference is the length of time. With complicated grief, grieving can extend way past 2 years. So I am going to touch up on both, but first we will go over the normal grief. It is interesting to point out that grief has been compared to physical illness. In the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah admonishes to bind up the brokenhearted, giving the impression that severe grief can somehow do damage to the heart. The loss of a loved one is psychologically traumatic to the same extent as being severely wounded or burned. Grief represents a departure from the state of health and well-being. Mourning can be seen as a course that takes time until restoration of function can take place. How much functional impairment there is a matter of degree. After one sustains a loss, there are certain tasks of mourning that must be accomplished for equilibrium to be reestablished and for the process of mourning to be completed. It is essential that the grieving person accomplish these tasks before mourning can be completed. Incompleted grief tasks can impair further growth and development. The first task of grieving is to come full face that the person is gone and will not return. Part of the acceptance of reality is to come to the belief that reunion is impossible, at least in this life. Some people hinder the completion of task 1 by denying that death is irreversible. The hope for a reunion with the dead person is a normal feeling. However, the chronic hope for such a reunion is not normal. Coming to an acceptance of the reality of the loss takes time, since it involves not only an intellectual acceptance, but also an emotional one. The second task involves working through to the pain of grief. It is necessary to acknowledge and work through this pain, or it will manifest itself through some symptoms or other form of aberrant behavior. If it is necessary for the bereaved person to go through the pain of grief in order to get the grief work done, then anything that continually allows the person to avoid or suppress this pain can be expected to prolong the course of mourning. The negation of this second task of working through the pain is not to feel. People can short-circuit task 2 in any number of ways, the most obvious being to cut off their feelings and deny the pain that is present, when in reality they need to indulge the pain, to feel it, and to know that one day it will pass. Sooner or later, some of those who avoid all conscious grieving break down, usually with some form of depression. Task 3 involves adjusting to an environment in which the deceased is missing. Not only do the bereaved have to adjust to the loss of roles previously played by the deceased, but death also confronts them with the challenge of adjusting to their own sense of self. Recent studies posit that for women who define their identity through relationships and caring for others, bereavement means not only the loss of a significant other, but also the sense of a loss of self. The bereaved person searches for meaning in the loss and its attendant life changes in order to make sense of it and to regain some control over life. The arresting of task 3 is not adapting to the loss. People work against themselves by promoting their own helplessness, by not developing the skills they need to cope, or by withdrawing from the world and not facing up. Most people do not take this negative course, however. They usually decide that they must fill the roles to which they are unaccustomed, develop skills they never had, and move forward with a reassessed sense of the world. Task 4 involves emotionally relocating the deceased and moving on with life. This is withdrawing emotional energy from the deceased and reinvesting it in another relationship. The task is to find an appropriate place for the dead in their emotional lives, a place that will enable them to go on living effectively in the world. It is difficult to find a phrase that adequately defines the incompletion of task 4, but I think the best description would perhaps be not loving. The fourth task is hindered by holding on to the past attachment rather than going on and forming new ones. Some people find loss so painful that they make a pact with themselves never to love again. Most people get stuck at this point in their grieving and later realize that their life in some way stopped at the point the loss occurred. So when is mourning finished? Mourning is finished when a person completes the final mourning phase of restitution, when the tasks of mourning are accomplished. One benchmark of a completed grief reaction is when the person is able to think of the deceased without pain. There is always a sense of sadness when you think of someone that you have loved and lost, but it is a different kind of sadness. it lacks the wrenching quality it previously had. The way people respond to spoken condolences gives some indication of where they are in the mourning process. The grateful acceptance of condolences is one of the most reliable signs that the bereaved is working through mourning satisfactorily. The incompletion of any of these tasks, or becoming stuck in any of these tasks, causes the mourner to go into complex grief, also known as complicated grief. In my next video, I will discuss normal grief, uncomplicated grief, and then I will discuss complicated grief. So make sure to follow to catch that video.